As I said earlier, that first Rolling Stones album has got two names, and there are really two versions, though they don't differ very much from each other. There's a UK version and a US version. The UK version is simply called The Rolling Stones. The US version called England's Newest Hitmakers, The Rolling Stones. The UK version released in April of '64, going to #1 in the charts, as we mentioned before, and the US version released in June of '64, coordinated with that tour that we just got done talking about in the last video. That goes to #11 in this country. Produced by Andrew Oldham, engineered by Bill Farley at Regent Sound in London. This album recorded in January and February of 1964. Regent Sound would for a while become one of the home studios for the Rolling Stones when they were recording in London. It was not the most sophisticated studio they could have used, but there was something about the vibe of that studio that they liked. There was something about the smallness of it that sort of they thought brought out the best of the group, or what the group was able to do. So Regent, and engineered by Bill Farley, sort of the early combination for a lot of this stuff. Now, as we look down the tracks that make it into these two albums, the only real difference is that the song Mona, I Need You Baby, a Bo Diddley tune, appears on the UK version, but not on the US version. And the song Not Fade Away, the Buddy Holly cover, appears on the US version, but not on the UK version. So in the UK, it was pretty much the practice that if you released a song as a single, you didn't include it on an album. However, it was the practice in the US that if you released a single, you did include it on the album, because that would encourage people to buy the record. And so you'll often see that when we look at the American versions of the albums, they include hits. The British versions of it frequently do not. And so that's the one difference between these two. We start to get into some of the later records, the next couple of weeks. There's going to be some big differences where there's 3-4 songs different between the two releases. Some of the songs that get released in the UK only are collected together to create new records. December's Children, for example, is one of those records we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. So anyway, we look at this record and what do we see? Look at this Rolling Stones record. We see 9 cover versions. We see 2 songs that are almost covers. They're Nanker Felge tunes where they've taken previously existing tunes and turned them into other tunes. So they're almost covers. And 1 Jagger and Richards original song, Tell Me. The first real song that the Jagger and Richards, Mick and Keith, decide to bring to the band. Now, they'd been bringing their songs to other artists all along. This is the first song I think is right for the Rolling Stones. So there'll be more to be said about that very soon. So what do we see as cover versions? And I'll include all the songs from both versions, and that's kind of the way I'm going to think about this. I'm going to think about the US and the UK releases, even though the dates will differ, as sort of one big project. So instead of thinking of 2 different records, we have one record, conceptually at least, that includes the songs that are included at least on one of the 2 versions. So we've got a Buddy Holly tune, Not Fade Away, a Chuck Berry song, Route 66, that had been a song for Berry in 1961, a Muddy Waters song, I Just Want to Make Love to You, Jimmy Reed's Honest I Do, there's Mona, I Need You Baby, a Bo Diddley track, and Now I've Got a Witness is based on Marvin Gaye's Can I Get a Witness? That's one of the Nanker Felge tunes. Little by Little, based on Jimmy Reed's Shame, Shame, Shame. We already talked about that. That's the Nanker Felge tune. Then I'm a King Bee, a Slim Harpo tune. Carol, yet another Chuck Berry track. Can I Get a Witness? A Marvin Gaye track. You Can Make It If You Try, a Solomon Burke track. And Walking the Dog, a Rufus Thomas cover. And add to that Tell Me, the first Jagger Richards song released by the Stones. So when we look at these cover versions, what can we take away from this? First of all, that there are so many covers, and that the Rolling Stones are in many ways primarily a cover band for the first 3 or 4 records. Even live, they love to play these tunes. I mean, they could play, even when they have enough original songs that they could play nothing but original songs, they still like to play the cover tunes. Being a cover band was actually kind of a normative thing for club groups and pop groups coming up in the 1960s. The Beatles were a fantastic cover band. Lots of these groups, the Animals, the Yardbirds, all of them were covering other people's songs. There's not an inherent weakness. We would look today back at a group doing a lot of covers and say, oh, well, were they not original to have their own music? But that's really not the way to view this music. It was very typical for these groups to do these cover versions. So what do we see from the cover versions? Well, these cover versions adapt tempos and energy to fit with the live shows. So when you play the song that's on the Stones record and you compare that with the original version, if the original version was a kind of slow blues number, it ends up getting rocked up. And a pretty good example of that is listen to the original version of Muddy Waters' I Just Want to Make Love to You and compare that with the version that the Stones do. The Stones version is much more up-tempo. That's because the way they're thinking is, they know what these kids are going to want at live shows, and kind of a moody, slow-tempo blues number is not going to get the kids on their feet and create excitement at a live show. So they rock it up. So a lot of times you'll see that even with something like Chuck Berry's Route 66, which is already kind of a rockin' tune, Chuck's tempo is a little bit more laid back. The Rolling Stones really drive it. Charlie Watts is especially sort of playing on what we say on top of the beat, which is really, it's not rushing, but it feels like the song is really sort of bright and sprightly and rhythmically, and the feel of it is very sort of up and energetic. That's what they were going for. So when they will change these cover versions around, it will mostly be to make them more suitable for their live performance and their sort of approach, their high energy approach. Some of the songs won't be changed very much at all. If the way the song is recorded is actually about the right feel for them, they'll pretty much do the song the way it is in the record, and they'll make certain adjustments in the arrangement. So if there are not horns, maybe a line will go on the guitar or something like that, but they'll make their own arrangement. But they'll basically keep the song pretty much intact. I have to say these first cover versions on the first couple records are pretty good, but they're going to get a lot better. The Stones didn't have the benefit of having played together as a band for a long period of time before they did these first recordings. And you can kind of hear it at the beginning. I'm not saying that any part of it sounds bad. It's just that subsequent records just sound so much better when it comes to these cover versions. So they're still kind of learning on the job, learning their craft as they go. The album tracks, it doesn't really matter a whole lot because remember, still at this time, singles are the thing. Or EPs are the thing. Albums are kind of a secondary market. There's something that the album hasn't yet become the primary focus of rock music, and so it's maybe not so crucial that some of these cover versions are maybe not some of their best recordings. Let's think for just a little bit about the presentation of the album itself. In the case of this one, there's a cover photo on the album by a guy by the name of Nicholas Wright. It's a very Beatle-esque shot playing on shadows on the faces. Now, if you think about that first Beatles album, With the Beatles, Meet the Beatles, from just about this time, late 63, early 1964, remember how the faces are partly in shadow, partly in light. Well, if you look at this first Rolling Stones cover, the photograph by Nicholas Wright kind of captures that kind of effect. It's maybe the sort of most Beatle-y of the covers that we find. And then, of course, on the back, you get the liner notes by Andrew Loog Oldham. We're going to want to pay attention to album packaging because as we go forward in the catalog, especially as we get into 67, 68, 69, get to Sticky Fingers, album packaging plays a big role in how the music is presented, as not only for the Stones, but for a lot of groups. So we'll just set this as a kind of a marker of where we start from. England's newest hit makers and a photograph that looks a lot like the Beatles. All right, well, let's talk in the next video about more singles and a second EP in 1964.